Welcome. Welcome everyone to today's lunchtime webinar. This one I think is going to be a really useful one for so many people around the country. Today's webinar is all about what is needed in practice to get us towards net zero carbon and also what's stopping us. You're going to be hearing from Matt Fulford about the results of the Wayfinders Project research. I always begin all of my webinars with a trailer for upcoming attractions, and we've got a lot of webinars coming up between now and June. In March, we have the all-important subject of environmental fundraising. We've got 3 different webinars. The first 2 are really around kind of setting out the landscape of what funders are out there and then how to go about beginning environmental fundraising. And then part 3 is a new one, which is for slightly more experienced fundraisers wanting to go into more depth with some of the environmental grant makers. We've then got a repeat in April of our session on embodied carbon. So that's how we weigh up all of the carbon that's gone into making the things we use in our building projects against the savings that might come from those projects. Later in April, we have a session about the Great Big Green Week, which will be running again in September. That's the Climate Coalition, of which the Church of England is a member. Their big signature week in the year when they ask organisations all around the country to get involved in taking environmental action and running events. And so we've got a webinar for churches and church schools who are interested in taking part in the Great Big Green Week in April. Then later in April, we are repeating our EcoChurch webinars. So again, that's 3 parts. We have a getting started with EcoChurch, gaining momentum and working towards an award, and then how EcoChurch links in with net zero carbon. At the beginning of May, we've got the next in our series of webinars specifically for schools. And in that one, it's going to be Matt again speaking that day. He's going to be feeding back a lot of research from a wide number of school energy audits that he's carried out, and also going into more depth on the schools that you're going to hear about today from the Wayfinders Project. And then we've got 2 new dates that have, this is the first time I've publicised them, which are briefings on the faculty rule changes that you might know were agreed by General Synod in February to bring the faculty rules more in line with net zero carbon. And those rules come into effect on the 1st of July. So we're running 2 briefing sessions if you want to know more about what the changes are and how they might affect you. When I finished with the housekeeping, I'll pop that link in the chat, which takes you through to the details of all of those webinars and how you can book them. In terms of the logistics of this session, we'll be using the Q&A as usual for the questions rather than the chat. So please do, if you've got a question, make sure it goes into the Q&A. You can also see other people's questions there. And if you see one that's similar to yours, you can put a thumbs up next to their question. When we've finished, we'll start at the top with the questions that have got the most votes and keep working our way through. Because I'm conscious that really a lot of people did book for today and it's such an important topic, Matt has agreed to stay on for an extended Q&A. So the webinar will be 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll do the first few questions. And then I'm conscious a lot of you will probably only have an hour for your lunch hour and will probably want to leave at 1. But those of you who've got longer, please do stay on. Denise and Matt and I are available here up until 2 o'clock if there are still questions. After the webinar, as usual, I'll send everybody the slides and any links from the chat. So please do take notes, but don't feel you have to scribble everything down. And I'm recording the webinar and it will be shared through our website as usual. In terms of introductions for today, you're going to learn so much from hearing Matt speak. I heard him give a talk similar to this one to the Environmental Fringe event that we ran at General Synod a couple of weeks ago, and it's so useful. Matt is a very experienced energy auditor and expert in low carbon. He runs his own business, Inspired Efficiency. He is the sustainability advisor for Gloucester Diocese, and he has done, oh, how many now, Matt? I couldn't even get hundreds of church and school energy audits. So he really knows his stuff. I'm also joined by my colleague Denise today, who will join us again when it gets to the Q&A section. Denise is our Net Zero Carbon Planning Officer, and she has been leading the recent consultation on the Routemap to Net Zero Carbon. So I asked Denise if she could join today, so if there are questions that are more on our side, she and I can pick them up when it gets to the Q&A. Now, normally with the webinars, we dive straight into the speaker, but for this particular one, I thought it was important to give you a little bit of context, to put the Wayfinders project that you're going to hear about in the context of the other work that we're doing. So I imagine that everybody joining today will know that back in February 2020, Synod passed their landmark motion calling on recognising the global climate emergency as a crisis for God's creation and a fundamental injustice, and calling upon all parts of the Church of England to work to achieve year-on-year reductions in emissions and urgently examine what will be required to reach net zero emissions by 2030. We've been doing many things to try and realise Synod's ambition, one of which is the Routemap to Net Zero Carbon that Denise has been leading on the consultation process for. And one of them was commissioning the Wayfinders research to take a set of our buildings and look at what would it actually take in practice to get to net zero carbon, so that those two pieces of work can inform each other and that the findings of the Wayfinder project can really help stress test and improve the Routemap to net zero carbon. For context for everything that Matt's going to tell you, this pie chart shows you the main sources of the Church of England as a whole's greenhouse gas emissions from our 2020 data. Now, we know 2020 was an unusual year because of buildings being closed because of the pandemic. We suspect that that's probably made the church segment of this pie chart smaller than it would be in a normal year, but the story will be roughly the same, which is that schools make up about half of the Church of England's carbon footprint. Then the next biggest slice being churches, and the next slice after that being housing. Housing, obviously, we have many buildings, each one with a relatively low carbon footprint, but we have a lot of them. Then there are some things like our cathedrals and our offices, where we have a very small number of them, but they have a high carbon footprint each. If you take as a very good rule of thumb that the carbon footprint of a building is going to be basically related to how big is the space that you're trying to heat and how many hours a week are you trying to heat it, then that gives you a good sense of why our schools come out so high, even though we have 4 times as many churches as we do have schools. Within that, it's really important to remember that the main source of our energy use is our heating. We know from this sample of churches and church halls, 84% of their energy use, so that's electricity, oil and gas, was for their heating. All of that background knowledge about the Routemap, about the needing to focus on our highest energy use buildings, needed to focus on our heat, that was what led us to start the Wayfinder project. What we did, we nationally commissioned this piece of research commissioned by the Environment Programme and carried out by Matt and his colleagues from Inspired Efficiency. What we did was we chose a sample of 12 buildings from around the country, which we chose because they were high energy use, big, busy buildings. We chose 3 secondary schools, 3 primary schools, 4 churches, a Theological Education Institution, and 1 of our diocesan offices. And with the churches in particular, although with all of the buildings, we looked for a mixture between rural and urban, and we looked for a mixture of geography, north and south, to try and have, whilst it's a small sample, to try and choose a useful and representative sample of our highest energy use buildings. Not our typical small rural churches, deliberately looking for what are those highest energy use buildings, because we know that if we can make savings there, there'll be really material savings. And just to really bring that point home even more strongly, bear with me, I know that this is a slightly complicated slide, but it's a really important one, so I just wanted to show it to you. Each of these bars is a particular building. So the first 2, this is the average from the energy footprint tool data. The average carbon footprint of a small rural church is only 1.4 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent a year. That's really low. A typical UK resident will be somewhere between 10 and 12 tonnes a year. So our small, often rural churches, really the carbon footprint's already very low. The average for our larger urban churches is 21.4. These 4 red bars here, these are the 4 churches that were chosen to be part of the Wayfinders Project. And you can see they've got a much higher carbon footprint, certainly these 3 do, than the average church. We then show the diocesan office, a TEI, a Theological Education Institution, and then the primaries. At the time of running this webinar, 2 of the 3 primaries have had their audits. One of them was delayed by COVID, and the 3 secondaries. So you can see that when you're listening to Matt, when you're hearing what he's found out about the technology that's needed and the cost of that and the savings of that, that's in the context that we're talking about these high energy use buildings. Please don't listen to it and think, okay, that maps over directly to my church, or that maps over directly to my building. They're what we need to focus on for those big buildings where we know we can make big savings in energy use if we approach it correctly. And just to bring that home, if you look at this 1.4 and then this largest of the secondary schools that Matt went to, 400 times higher in that one secondary school than an average small rural church. That, I think, is everything, from me. So if I stop sharing and hand you over to Matt to get us going. Tell us what you found out, Matt.
Excellent. Thank you, Catherine. And good afternoon to everybody who's joined. It is fantastic that so many of you have taken an hour out of your day to hear these findings, and I hope that that is will be a useful hour to you. It's certainly been really interesting going around these, as Catherine says, these large energy using buildings on the Church of England estate and seeing what can be done. Just get the technology to work. So this was the Wayfinders Project. This is what it looks like. As Catherine said, we went around a number of schools, primary and secondary, and some of those schools were deliberately picked as well because they are actually large energy using schools. So not just because schools are large energy users, but even within the schools category, they are large energy using ones themselves. Modern buildings, historic buildings, beautiful buildings, perhaps some less beautiful buildings in there as well. And you might be surprised to see a picture of a swimming pool on there, because actually of the secondary schools we went around to, and it does actually occur in primary schools, there wasn't in primary schools we went to here, there are swimming pools at a lot of these schools, and they are a really intensive area of energy usage. So it's very relevant that that's here. And that may not have been what you're expecting initially to see on a talk about Church of England and achieving net zero, but it is an important part of that. And what we found within all of these buildings, in the complete diversity of how they're used and the age they're constructed, the listed status and everything else, we managed to find in all of these buildings that there is a technical solution that they can all be made net zero carbon. So that was our focus. Can we make them net zero carbon? What needs to be done? And the first really important answer that we've come back with is, yes, this can be done. It can be done with today's technology, and all of these can achieve that net zero carbon status. Now, in achieving that, we're essentially trying to get rid of any usage of either gas or oil, and that's either gas in mains form or in LPG tank form. So it's basically making them fossil fuel free. What we've said within that net zero carbon piece is you can purchase electricity, or you can generate your own electricity on site, which can be 100% renewable. And therefore, they're all looking to get rid of gas and oil and to make more use of electricity for areas such as heating and hot water. So that's the real key kind of element in that. But the first really clear message that I would hope that you'll all go away with is, we can do this. We can do this with today's technology. We haven't got to wait for any new magic bits of technology to come through, and that includes, we haven't got to wait for hydrogen, for example, to be developed. We can do this with today's technology. We can do it now. So in terms of really answering the exam question and technically what needs to be done, and remember, I'll keep reminding you throughout this, this is for our very largest energy using buildings. And what we found was that air-to-air source heat pumps really were one of the main technical solutions that came up time and time again for our larger buildings. Not so relevant to our smaller churches, but certainly within these large buildings, the schools, the offices, and our larger churches, which I've tended to find as kind of our daily used churches, that's my shorthand, rather than our Sunday used churches. I know that isn't perfect, but that's the sort of the two sort of shorthand categorizations I've used. So in those larger daily use churches, air-to-air source heat pumps are a very relevant solution in there. And I'm going to talk more about heat pumps and their different types, because you probably hear the word heat pump and you hear less about the air-to-air bit, as opposed to an air-to-water or a high temperature or other types of heat pumps. So I'm going to do a little bit towards the end of this presentation on actually the differences between those technologies and where they're relevant. But what's really useful to know now is that actually air-to-air heat pumps were really one of the main parts of our toolkit that we're going to need to deliver this in there. Another area which often gets forgotten about, almost the sort of Cinderella area of getting rid of gas and oil usage, is actually the hot water. It's particularly relevant within schools and to a degree offices, and certainly within the TEI, where we've got residential use as well. Actually, we use a lot of fossil fuels, lots of gas and oil to create and generate our hot water. And at all sites, without exception, some form of electric hot water heating is needed. And again, there are lots of solutions for that in slightly different forms, but electric point of use was really the most relevant one out there. Even for our secondary schools, it's a very, very common thing to find within primary schools, but in secondary schools and actually all other buildings as well. Again, I've got a little bit more detail on that towards the end of the presentation if you're less familiar with that technology. Solar PV, we found, has got a really strong relevance, particularly on these larger sites. It came much more relevant when we're just focusing on these large sites than it does when you're focusing across the entire estate in the smaller churches. And we found that almost all sites could actually have a viable PV system that could be installed, and within the listed buildings, and which was predominantly the churches, because they're the bigger churches, we tend to find they had actually large and often relatively complex roof structures, which meant there were certainly roofs where they would be relevant to install from the listed categorization, where they had those as well. We had an unlisted church in there, which obviously was slightly easier in there as well. Also, we do have newer buildings on the estates. We have newer schools or blocks within schools. We've got some new diocesan offices, and those were included within this programme as well. And what really came to the fore with these new sites is they have quite sophisticated control systems, normally called a building management system, abbreviated to BMS. And how that was set up, how that was commissioned in the first place, and how it is used was incredibly significant to the energy use of that building. And almost all of those really new buildings we've been around, the ones that have been built in the last 10 or 15 years, had this BMS control in there, but all of them had massive opportunities to make that control better by using the controls that are already on site. I'm trying to avoid saying that those controls were being misused. That would be slightly incorrect, but they weren't very well set up, and there was an awful lot more that could be gained from using what we've got on site in the way of controls much better. So those are really the headline points. Air-to-air source heat pumps, electric point of use, solar PV has got a strong relevance, and where it's a new building, really getting those controls smart. That's really what's going to make the mainstay of this difference. But the really important thing is that in all of that excitement about heat pumps and PVs and all of those really interesting and sometimes funky and exciting bits and pieces, we really mustn't forget the basics. Fabric insulation was valid on 80% of the sites we went round, even with all of that diversity out there, even with those newer buildings in there as well. Some form of insulation is still needed. So there's a long way to go on getting an insulation right. That could be up in the roofs, lofts or above suspended ceilings. It could be under floors, but also very much within cavity walls, particularly on our school estate in there. And whilst sort of still on the schools bit, we've still got an awful lot of single glazed windows out there. We found single glazed windows in all of the secondary schools. Not saying all of their windows were single glazed, but I found at least one single glazed window. In fact, there was at least a handful of them on all the secondary schools we went to visit, and it's not uncommon to find them on primary schools as well. So we've still got these basics to do, and just, you know, replacing the windows, getting rid of single glaze sometimes, which is taped together with sellotape, really is still an important aspect that we need to consider out there. And the other one, which has now thankfully become very common, very normal, and some people think, well, we've pretty much done that, we've ticked that box, is actually the lighting. And we found that there is still a conversion to LED or very low energy lighting that needs to be completed on 90% of the sites. So almost all of the sites we went to needed some form of low energy lighting put into some part of them. Many sites have already got LED installed, and that could range from just a couple typically in the reception areas or those very public facing areas. But all sites, or so 90% of the sites, have still got it somewhere on site. There's still work that needs to be done there now. So technically, that's really what needs to be done. One slide, it's maybe as simple as that, but there are obviously a lot of challenges on the way. I thought it would also be useful to touch on, actually, what did we find was less of a priority? And we were trying to look at the wider carbon footprint of the Church of England. So we did look at transport, and we were asking the sites about how people were getting to their buildings, what sort of transport they might have done during their normal operation, be that a school or the church or the college or the diocesan office. And we really found that actually the transport impact was really very minimal, possibly actually more minimal on these larger sites, which tended to be better connected to public transport than perhaps some of the smaller sites. Maybe something we need to test there. And really the only significant elements of transport that we found which were under direct control were actually school minibuses. So most of the secondary schools have minibuses, and almost all of those were diesel minibuses. So that's definitely an area within transport to focus on. But I'd say transport overall, very minimal. A lot of people walking, cycling. You can see there the picture of the main transport for the TEI I went to, which is a very large bike store. But what also could be relevant around transport is actually making sure we've got electric vehicle charging points where they are relevant, and certainly within schools and for the staff that do need to travel and commute by car, that is relevant. But really, transport, actually not a high priority. We also find that actually embodied carbon, because we were looking at actually how much carbon goes into making the stuff, the heat pumps, the lights, the insulation, whatever it might be, and installing that into the building. So we did try to do a kind of embodied carbon assessment of the measures that we were looking at. And we found that most of the measures actually have a carbon payback, i.e. the carbon that goes into making the light or the heat pump is a certain amount, and how much carbon does it save in a year? And we found that most of the carbon paybacks are less than a year. So the amount that's gone into making it is saved within that first year of operation. The only areas that seem to be much greater than that are with PV panels and with windows, and really that's a sign of the embodied carbon that goes into making glass. Both of them are actually quite heavy, so the heavier things tend to be the more carbon you have in making them, and glass is a very energy intensive material to make. So those are really the areas where, if we want to focus in on embodied carbon and its impact, it's within the PV panels and the windows. The rest of it we really found not to be massively significant on that. Another area which we focused on was actually and asked to look at was is asbestos in our buildings, particularly in our school buildings, causing a problem? Is that a major barrier? And actually we found that most organisations were saying no, it's not really a problem. we know where it is because we've got our asbestos surveys. If we find it, we know how to deal with it. That wasn't really a barrier in there. That we looked for it, we tried to test it, but found it wasn't the case. So really, those are the things that perhaps a little bit cautious about saying that we could relax on, but they're certainly not the main high priority focus. Where our focus needs to be is onto the boilers and getting rid of gas and oil boilers. That's got to be our primary focus to achieving net zero. We very much looked at what the costs were to achieve net zero within these buildings, and do remember what Catherine said earlier. This is very much looking at the cost within our largest energy using buildings. So this isn't our normal hundreds, thousands of small rural churches. That's not what we're looking at in this project. This is for those really big energy using buildings out there. And this isn't to make the entirety of those buildings, or in some cases, campuses or estates, when looking at secondary schools, the entirety of that into a net zero carbon site. So what we found in there, you can sort of see the total costs of that. Secondary schools getting up to be sort of the £950,000 per secondary school to completely convert that from where it is at the moment into net zero carbon. Primary schools, obviously much less, though they're smaller, so that was coming into about £350,000. You see the diocesan offices there, and actually a big, busy, daily used church. Again, the sort of the £300,000 mark to do the complete replacement was where that tends to be coming out of. But the one church we did have that was still a high energy using church, but actually mainly a Sunday used church. So we'd have one of those in here. Very much less than that. We're looking at sort of £30,000. In that, and that correlates to some other work we've done outside of this as well. So you can see that there's a massive difference in the scale of that. So there is significant investments that's needed. Schools massively need the most significant investment in that, but fortunately they probably have some of the more reliable and potential funding routes available to them as well. When we look at those costs in terms, and we split them another way, so rather than split them by building, we look at splitting them by technology. What is it we need to spend the most money on? It's quite clear from that graph, blindingly obvious, that actually it's the heat pumps which are by far and away the largest element of cost, where the investment will be needed. The other areas in there, there's some money to be spent on lighting, but that tends to be just because there's a lot of it still to do. Windows are relatively more costly than other forms of insulation, but you can see that they're all very much pale in significance when compared to the costs of the heat pump in there. But the good news, almost, if there is any in that, is actually heat pumps are rather expensive at the moment, but are expected to fall in costs. We are seeing, I'm almost seeing on a, well, if it's not a weekly basis, it's certainly a monthly basis, new products around heat pumps coming out all the time. Each one of those are incrementally better than the previous one. And we're also seeing just initial signs that actually the skill base needed to install those is starting to increase. We've got a bit of an issue at the moment where we've got way more demand for the installation of heat pumps than we have supply in terms of skilled people that can install it. But that base, and particularly existing boiler engineers, are beginning to reskill to be able to install heat pumps. You've probably seen that even just anecdotally on the sides of the vans of the person that comes to service your boiler, perhaps starting to say heat pumps on them as well. So that's starting to happen, and we are expecting the costs in those areas to fall over time. So it's a very high cost at the moment, and it will still always remain probably the most significant area for investment. But is expected to drop over that time. The other area I sort of wanted to look at was actually the cost savings. And the cost of doing it, as well as the carbon saving of doing it. So the annual cost savings, where we're going to get the most financial saving from installing this, is actually within the lighting and PV. That gives us the best payback in there. That's where we're going to deliver the most savings. Heat pumps, I'm going to say at the moment, but with the energy prices we've been paying in sort of in the last sort of 6 months to a year ago, heat pumps aren't necessarily delivering a direct financial saving in all cases. And I'll come on to a little bit more about that later. But you can see with the graph on the right-hand side there, that's where we're getting our biggest carbon saving from. So heat pumps on their own don't necessarily deliver a financial saving, but they are really massively needed to deliver the carbon saving. It's the lighting and the PV that delivers the biggest cost saving, but they deliver a much lower carbon saving in there. But what was interesting was going back and looking at all of these buildings that we looked at, and every single one of them, when you looked at it as a complete program of measures, so you didn't just isolate out the heat pumps or the lighting or whatever on its own, but you looked at the complete range of measures that need to be done on those buildings, all of them, every single building we went around to, if you did everything, would result in a cost saving in the annual operation of that building. So there are financial savings to be had in here. Some very long paybacks, some short paybacks as well. But actually, if we do this, we will save money in terms of the annual operating costs in there, even though some heat pumps in some locations don't do that on their own. They need other measures alongside them to be able to do that. Now, what was also interesting is going around and having a look at these buildings that are high energy users that some of them haven't really done a great deal yet, and realizing that actually we're already doing this. This isn't new stuff. We've got biomass boilers on our estate. We've got air-to-air source heat pumps, as you can see in the picture there. We've got electric hot water heating. That's in the form of a more centralized tank, but we've got plenty of little ones stuck under sinks everywhere as well. We've got ground source heat pumps. And these aren't pictures that I've just gone along and gone into a rather famous search engine and tried to get. These are all pictures I took whilst doing the 12 energy audits of this sample of sites. These exist even in these sample sites that we were looking at on the Wayfinders program. So this technology may sound new and novel to many people, but actually we're already doing it. We don't sometimes realizing that actually what is heating or cooling that building could be described as a heat pump, or that actually the hot water that comes out the tap in that particular classroom or sink is actually heated by electricity, and that's a good thing. But it's out there, we're doing it, this is known and common to many people, and perhaps we need to shine a greater spotlight on where we're doing it and where it's doing well. I just wanted to mention as well, just to cover this, we've got a lot of churches as well that do have electric under pew heating, and that's what we're seeing as being needed for the smaller churches that are out there. And that one Sunday used church that we did have in the programme, this would be the most suitable heating solution for that. So as well as all the bigger stuff that we've got out there in our larger energy using buildings, we also have the solutions for the smaller ones as well, and these are examples which are fairly widely distributed around our church estate of going electric heating in there. So we can do this, we've got the technology to do it. In fact, it delivers a cost saving when we do it, albeit that we may have some long paybacks within there. And we're already doing it on parts of our estate. We already have the knowledge. So then the question arises, well, why aren't we doing this everywhere? And this was another area that we very much examined with the sites we went round to ask them what the barriers were. Now, initially, the question was, all of the sites have heard of the 2030 net zero carbon target the Church of England set, and every single site was actually really supportive and engaged around that. They all want to do their bit. And there's the quote there from one church saying that actually, there's no lack of will and determination to do this. So I think in many cases, the hearts and minds piece is an open door. We've probably won that battle if we put it in those terms. It doesn't seem to be that people are going, oh no, I don't want to do that, I'm not interested. People seem to be very interested around it, and I think that's a testament to how many people have actually joined today's webinar. You're clearly interested in this, and that's very much what we found. The biggest issue, and I suppose this won't be a surprise to anybody, is how do we pay for this? So I think that's really useful to hear from Catherine about the funding webinars coming up, because that was by far and away the biggest issue. Many people across all ranges of buildings go, give me the money, we'll do it tomorrow. Now, obviously, they'll probably need to go and fundraise rather than be just given that money parachuted into them. But that was clearly the biggest issue out there, was financing it. The other issue that came up quite frequently was getting permission to do it, and actually not just within churches. I suppose it probably wouldn't be a surprise to many to be thinking that, you know, a lot of people were in church areas were worried about the faculty system, and can I get permission to do that within my highly listed church. But it also came up within schools as well, going, oh, will the local planning authority need to get involved on putting heat pumps out there and putting panels on the roofs, etc., etc. And this permission barrier was certainly coming to the fore in many cases as well. And the other barrier, which is when we unpicked it a little bit more, and will always be the case, is this challenge around how doing the works that are needed to be done to save energy and to save carbon compete against everything else that's going on. And that's not just in terms of the financial money, but also in the time and the headspace that people who are running these buildings and looking after them have, going like, I'm already really busy. When have I got time in my life to be able to build this project that needs to be done? A school, I think, actually described it really well, going, well, yeah, but what do I do with the small budget I've got this year? Do I go along and replace the projector screen and 6 computers in that classroom, or do I pay for some low energy lighting in my school? Because one area that the teachers are saying that's more important for the teaching and learning, but the other area is going to save us carbon and save us energy. So this sort of competition out there for both time and financial resources was really coming to the fore, and with issues all over the place on that, and the sense that still very much greater priority is being given to condition issues. So if we've got something already and it's failed, then that's where we've had to put our money first into making the condition better. And that even goes into some of the decoration and carpet and those kind of issues, and they're going, oh, I need to get that done before I focus on other things in there. And obviously with pressure on budgets, that makes that issue even worse. But really those big barriers in there were funding and permission. And say the key message at the bottom of that slide was going, the buildings, the people running those buildings are saying back to me on those audits, saying, look, if we know that you'll give us permission and we know that we can access the funding, then we can do this. So that was really the barriers that are out there that we need to work together to try and navigate our way around. I thought it'd be useful for each of the buildings, and these are just 2 examples, just running through actually what the sort of the route map looks like, because often we look at those costs and take a sharp intake of breath and go, gosh, that's a lot of money to find. And yes, it would be, and it is, but we haven't got to find that all in one go. And sometimes we'd have to find large proportions of that money in any case. So these are sort of a couple of typical route maps are out there saying, well, actually, what to focus on in the short term, what to focus on in the next 12 months. And you can see at the top there, it's like, look, focus on LED lighting, on lighting control, on some simple time clocks out there, insulate some of that pipe work. This was a school, so actually put a cover on that pool. It's a major energy loss. It's going to pay you back really quickly. So it was those kind of things. There's another, actually there's a TI at the bottom there, going, actually your first thing is just to make sure you're purchasing your energy from 100% renewable supply. You can optimize your controls. You actually haven't got to install anything. This is about setting them up really smart. That are in there. But you can see in there that there's one bit there on both of those examples saying, there's a heat pump, an air source heat pump to do. In the top example there, it's a sports block. In the bottom example there, it's the H block. Doesn't really matter where it is. And that's because the boilers in those 2 very specific areas have failed. They are broken down. They're being nursed along. They're definitely the end of their life. So you'd need to replace the boilers in any case. And what we're saying in those areas is, don't replace it with a like-for-like boiler, replace it with a heat pump. So The costs that we presented earlier are the total cost to do it. What we haven't done is then turn around and saying, but you would need to replace your boiler in any case. So that funding already needs to be there. You've got to do that. And in many cases, they've already got the budget to do that. And therefore, it's not the net additional cost that needs to be found that we presented. It's the total cost. So in many cases, these things need to be done or will need to be done in any case, just to maintain the heat and hot water within those. And then you can start to see that actually as we go through in the medium term, it tends to be the hot water and moving that off gas and onto electric that comes through. Often the solar panels are something that we probably ought to be thinking about in the medium term because they actually give a good payback in there as well. So we're starting to get that cost saving coming through and preparing our buildings more for being able to work better on heat pumps. So actually you'll tend to find the medium term on a lot of these recommendations is where the insulation comes in and the window replacement comes in. And then it's in the longer term when you'll see far more heat pumps coming through in the long-term area. And what the key to almost all of the timing of when these measures need to be made is actually how long does that boiler is expected to last. Boilers are said to last for about 15 years if you go and ask any engineer, but typically we're seeing on almost all of our estate people making them last longer than that. So it's quite common to see boilers being made to last at least 20 years. So, it's when that boiler needs replacing that is the main driver that is out there on that. There are some human barriers out there as well. So this is sort of where we need to sort of work very much with people rather than work with the buildings in there. And I've talked about that sort of competing priorities in there and the lack of the budget, but also having that clear technical knowledge of what needs to be done. Now, obviously, we've delivered that for these 12 sites. They've got those route maps you saw on the slide previous. They've got an audit report that very much says what needs to be done. So they now can go forward and go, look, when that boiler fails, I know I need to replace it with this solution here. I need to do that bit beforehand. And they have that route map going out there. But that's clearly a bit of knowledge that needs to be put in place. And another the confidence pieces of knowing that actually it's going to get the support, it's going to get the support of, the diocese, be that within the DAC or within the schools teams, that yes, this is something that we want to support and we'll help you through that. And knowing that there are funding solutions out there, those are really the bits that are needed. So many people would obviously love to have that money, that pot of money to do it just given to them, but actually even when you unpick it, then knowing that actually it can be funded and these are the funding solutions. And yes, you've got to go and work hard at doing that fundraising, but those routes are available and open to them. So we then looked at actually, so what are the main things that need to happen to make net zero carbon happen? And the big one is we need to be installing heat pumps and we need to stop installing boilers. And this is, this is a challenging bit. I would be turning around and saying that we are lobbying for the pensions team, who actually happen to be sitting outside the office from where I am presenting this from today, but many other areas of investment, saying, look, you want me to divest away from fossil fuels. Yet if we're installing a gas or an oil boiler, we are making an investment into using fossil fuels for the next 20 years of the life of that boiler. And that needs to stop. So we need to stop installing fossil fuel boilers into our buildings. And really, if you're asking me from getting down to a net zero carbon point of view, we need to stop doing that now. We ought to be looking at ourselves in the mirror and going, we can't put in gas or oil boilers anymore. And that's going to be a big challenge. And I know that's going to be quite a difficult thing for many people to hear and then act on. What we also really need is a basic decarbonisation plan for our buildings, so we know, and this could be done on one side of an A4 bit of paper. It doesn't need to be the detailed reports we've done here, but they know that actually this is what we need to do. We need to insulate that building. We need to replace those windows. We need to put in a heat pump in there. We need to put this bit in the hot water. We know what those steps are. But also what's really important is a heating and resilience plan. What happens when that boiler does break down? Because what we're often finding, and this came to the fore on actually a couple of the sites that we did for Wayfinders, is they're going, our boiler's just failed and we've got to replace it for a new one in the next few months because we need to have heat into that building if it's a school or wherever. The quickest and easiest things we can do is replace it like for like. So we need to start thinking about what the solution is for our heating when it breaks down, and making sure we have a plan in place that actually when that heating system breaks down, either we've put the backup system in already, we've installed it beforehand, which is quite relevant for a number of churches, or we know that we can actually hire in a temporary boiler room and they can come in on the back of a trailer and we can plug that in, and that gives us the time to get through to the summer when we can do a proper project, which is net zero carbon. We've obviously had if you haven't heard already, the change in faculty rules, which really helped to shift some of that focus away from like for replacement on boilers and more towards actually electrical heating within churches. And we really need to promote the benefits of that. There's really good news in there. We've got all these buildings that say they want to be and support getting to net zero carbon. The faculty rules have just made it easier for them to do so. And that really does help to get rid of that sort of permission barrier I talked about there. We do need to lobby government as well for changes within the secular planning system, particularly relevant for schools, for heat pumps in particular. We need more people to be more aware of the specifics around heat pumps and also electric hot water generation. We definitely need support with funding solutions. All schools teams ought to know about the public sector decarbonisation scheme because that's a major scheme in there. There are church ones in there as well, which those webinars are promoting. So we need to really build up the knowledge around that. I think certainly in the short term, in the next few years, we need to have some good centralized support in terms of developing those detailed solutions as more and more people get up to speed with what heat pumps are and how they work. But initially, there's probably going to need to be a little bit of help around building that knowledge up within our teams. And having, as I mentioned, solar panels pay back really well, as does lighting. So we can start to think quite inventively about different financing structures around those to support the installation of those measures, because of the payback really does support them. But one of the things in there that I said we particularly needed to do was get some training around the specifics of heat pumps. So I thought, well, there's no time like the present. And I've got you for about the next 5 minutes to run through very quickly some awareness around heat pumps and what they are. And you've probably heard of heat pumps, and you've probably heard of ground source heat pumps, and you know that involves stuff going in the ground. You've probably heard of air source heat pumps. What you probably haven't heard of is actually there's different flavors of those in between. So very quickly, ground source heat pump. You have something that goes into the ground. Often now, actually, it's a deep drill down in piles, extracts the heat out of the ground, compresses that, and puts that heat then into the building. It works really well with underfloor heating systems. It works really well when we're building new buildings, but incredibly difficult to get into existing buildings, particularly our churches, which obviously have ground which has lots of archaeology in them. So perhaps not so good for that. Now, all heat pumps have a measure of how efficient they are, which is called the coefficient of performance. Which is abbreviated to COP, and then that's measured over a whole heating season or a whole year. So it's a seasonal coefficient of performance. So that then gets to being an SCOP or a SCOP. And that is a ratio of how many units of electricity you need to put into that heat pump to get, how many units of heat you get out by putting 1 unit of electricity into that heat pump. So if you give it 1 unit of electricity, that pump does all its wonderful stuff. And with a ground source heat pump, you'll get 4 units of heat out for that 1 unit of electricity you put in. So that's got a coefficient of performance of 4. If you want to put it in another term, it's 400% efficient. And compare that to a gas boiler, and even the best gas boilers are probably only 95% efficient. This is 400% efficient. So you can understand why it's a good and well-promoted technology in there. Then we look at air-to-air source heat pumps. And I said this really probably is the mainstay of what we need to be doing. This is what they look like on the outside of a building. They probably look very familiar to you because you probably recognize them as air conditioning systems. And most air conditioning systems can heat as well as cool. And this is what these do. They're very, very, very similar. In fact, they're almost exactly identical to air conditioning systems. When you install an air-to-air source heat pump, there are just a few technical little bits of control system on it, which means that it heats as its main thing and cools as its secondary thing, rather than the other way around. But basically, they are exactly the same. They take heat out of the air, they compress it into a refrigerant gas, at the external unit. They put that refrigerant gas into the building, and then you have units inside the building that can push that heat into there. The coefficient of performance around that is 5, so even more efficient than ground source, so 500% efficient. They can also cool. That's quite important actually for a number of our schools where they do suffer from overheating on a few days in the summer as well. Because they also have blown air, they can rapidly warm up spaces. So they've got a warm-up period of around about 20 minutes into most rooms. If you think about a classroom or a hall, probably a little bit longer for very large churches, because they've got greater air volume. The external units, you can see here, there's one on the flat roof of a school, or they can go down at ground level and be covered up, as long as they've got airflow through them. This is a unit, and you've got another one just off the edge of this picture, actually the primary school that we went to there. Internally, a lot of people worry about what they look like internally, because you'll be very used to seeing these sorts of systems, the plastic white boxes on the wall with the little louvers that move in and out, or actually hidden up behind suspended ceilings. And these are very relevant actually for our schools. These sorts of solutions hidden up in suspended ceilings work really well. In little offices, these things again fit in quite nicely. You can get some more elegant looking units now, which just look a little bit nicer as well. But it doesn't all have to be the horrible lump of a white plastic stuck on the wall. We can also get internal units for air-to-air systems which are floor mounted and look very much like fan convector radiators. So you probably walked into that building in this room and think that was just a normal radiator on the wall. In fact, that's the internal unit of an air-to-air heat pump. So that's available. You can see different makes, different models out there. So they don't need to look much different from a radiator. And that's quite important when we come into churches, and those large churches where they may have already radiators down the wall, and we can replace them for these without the appearance changing massively. Air to water, very quickly on that, and this again is an air to water system installed at a school. That takes the heat out of the air, and it compresses that heat, but rather than putting it into a refrigerant gas, which is what the air-to-air system did, it puts it directly into the water system that then circulates around radiators. It's very good at producing water up to around about 50 degrees. After that, a normal air-to-air system, air-to-water system will struggle a little bit. You need good flow rates around a heating system. So if you've got small bore pipework, or you've got single pipe systems, we do still have, they ain't going to work. They need to have much better flow rates within that. Most of the plant is outside. You can see here, very minimal plant inside. You just see a bit of pipework and a few pumps and a few control panels on the walls. No major plant inside at all, which can sometimes be helpful. But actually their coefficient of performance is much less. So that's about a 3.5. It's about 350% efficient. So compare that to air, which is 500%. You can see that why air-to-air is perhaps coming to be more relevant. You can have high temperature air to water systems. So see that one of the major failures on the earlier one was actually it only produced water up to around 50 degrees. And within a lot of our radiator systems, we need hot water that's hotter than that. So you can get high temperature air-to-air systems. So that produces water up to about 75 degrees. It's got a secondary cycle, so it almost goes through two versions of the kind of compressing the heat within the heat pump part, but actually that reduces its efficiency. So that brings it down to about 2.5 or 250% efficient. But it is easier to integrate with existing radiator systems. It does need internal and external space, because you've got these two elements going on. You've got the heat pump itself, and you've got the internal unit gives that secondary kind of boost to get that temperature up. So you need both going on, and they do tend to be rather more expensive as well. So they're still relevant, they're still part of our toolkit, but they are less efficient and they are more expensive in there. Electric point of use hot water heaters, you've probably seen them, but this is what we need to have everywhere. These sorts of units you can see there on your slide, hidden underneath sinks. You can get units that range from just a few litres that are very useful to doing a wash hand basin or a small class sink, up to 100 litres, which is much more ideal for big commercial kitchens that we might have within our schools and our offices and the like. And you can also get instantaneous ones that just heat the water as it flows through and have no storage at all, which is obviously very good for Legionella in there. And you can now get centralized electric hot water systems as well. Normal tank, as we're used to seeing, but actually the top half of this tank, you can just sort of not half, sorry, top section of the tank, just above that light grey line there, is actually an air source heat pump. And actually you've got a packaged unit, a cylinder of hot water, which has got an air source heat pump on the top of it. That's ducted in the same way as a flue would have gone out to external air. So that can go directly into plant rooms, which is really useful actually where we've got things like lots of showering going on in sports blocks and we need a large volume of stored hot water. So we've got those solutions out there as well. So I thought I'd just run through that very quickly. So hopefully you'll forgive me for taking a few minutes to go through that at the end and just bring up that familiarization of heat pumps. So just as a sort of reminder, really, even with the broad range of buildings that we've got, the range of ages, of listings, of styles, of everything else, we've got the technical solutions. I've just described those main ones that we need to deliver net zero carbon. We can do it today. Technically, they also deliver that cost saving in there as well. Yes, there are some barriers that we need to work through, but by working together, I think that's really going to be a solution that we can get there, and 2030 is achievable. I hope that helps. I think we're now going to go into many questions, and I can see some already out there.
Thank you so much, Matt. So much information there, so much insight that you brought from the reviews that you've done. We do have a lot of questions.
46 I've just seen, yes.
Why don't you take a quick sip of your tea whilst people, if you can all find the Q&A, have a quick skim down of the questions that are already there and put a thumbs up next to the ones that you're most interested in. Or if you've got something new, please do add it to the list. I'm conscious that a couple of the questions we typed an answer, but that means they disappear off the list. So if you had a question and the typed answer didn't quite hit the spot, please do just enter it again and then it'll work its way to the top. As I said at the beginning, Matt and Denise and I are here till 2 for an extended Q&A. Please don't feel you have to stay all the time till 2 o'clock if you're listening. I'm conscious you'll have been fitting this into your lunch hour. So if you need to get away, completely understand, but we'll be here till 2 o'clock answering questions until we run out of questions or get to 2 o'clock. Right, let me look and see what is the one with the most thumbs up at the moment. Oh, it's about stained glass windows. Can we ever double glaze stained glass windows in traditional churches? So from the church energy audits that we analysed, we a couple of years ago got 180 of the church energy audits have been done and analysed all of them. And I can't think of a time when one of the recommendations was to double glaze stained glass windows. That recommendation tends not to come up on church energy audits because it's a very expensive and very difficult way of getting a relatively small saving compared to other things that you can do in the building. I have seen church energy audits that recommend secondary glazing or double glazing of minor windows, so vestries, offices, church halls, but I can't think of an occasion when I've seen it recommended for the stained glass windows. If you are considering it for your stained glass, of course, you need to get expert advice about how, whether it would cause any damage to the stained glass. You can install, it's called environmental protective glazing, isn't it? Which is kind of just inside the window and has a gap at the top of the bottom. And that does have some environmental benefits in terms of thermal efficiency. But even that tends to be a very expensive solution for a relatively small energy saving. Because you need really expert custom cabinetry to get fitted secondary glazing on stained glass. Matt, is there anything there that doesn't accord with what you would say? Or
no, that's fine.
Right, the next question says, oh, it's about a fan noise. It's a question that comes up a lot about pumps, doesn't it? What is the reality when you stand next to an air-to-air source heat pump? How noisy is it?
Okay, so fan noise, if you went back 10 years ago, fan noise with air-to-air heat pumps was significant. Almost every air source heat pump now on the market is what they call whisper quiet, and is normally measured at a distance of either 2 or 5 meters away, and actually they normally measure both. And by the time you get to 5 meters away, it's normally the background decibel level that you'd have in a library. So I can't turn around and say that there isn't a fan noise, but the fan noise 5 meters away is probably equivalent of your fridge. So there is this slight whir. If the air-to-air source heat pump is noisier than that, it's probably been installed wrongly. And that's often actually with the mounting feet on the bottom, and it's a vibrating and rattling going on. It's not actually the heat pump per se. It's just the sort of vibration from it, which is just an incorrect installation on there. Almost every major hotel chain actually has air-to-air heat pumps, and you sleep with your windows open. They probably put them up on the roof, which is often quite a useful place to put them. Even within churches, we can put them in hidden valleys, which by the time the roof baffles the noise, you just won't be able to hear it at all. I've actually, in the middle of COVID, this is an interesting anecdote. In the middle of COVID, I was sitting in the playground of the school that's got that air to water source heat pump that I actually had a picture of on one of the slides. And we all met outside for a pre-start meeting for actually a re-roofing project that was needed. And we were probably sitting about 2 meters away from the air source heat pumps that were going at the time. We quite happily had a meeting at socially distanced spaces outdoors, and we could hear the bird noise over the top of them. It would be wrong to say they are completely silent. They're not. They do have a whir to them, but it is almost unnoticeable. And as soon as you start to put them up on roofs, etc., then you would not be able to hear them.
And that's for the external units of the air source heat pumps. Is it the same answer for the internal units that are sending the warm air into the building?
Yes, so for the air-to-air internally, again, we'll all be used to be sitting in offices where you've got these things going on, and again, hotel rooms, you often have them in there, so you're all used to probably have slept in a room with one that's been going, and you've hopefully had a good night's sleep. So again, there is some noise, but it's very much of a background whir level of noise. Interestingly, with air-to-air heat pumps, one of the things that can sometimes be an issue with noise is they do produce a bit of condensation, which needs to be taken away, and that has a little pump on it. So sometimes actually mounting them on an external wall, so you don't need to pump the condensed strain from it, can be really advantageous because it gets rid of that noise. But it's a really minor issue. So you've got to need to be careful on the installation, need to be thoughtful. But generally, with both cases, it's a background fan noise rather than anything of significance concern.
Very good. So the next question is from Phil, is around costs. We need to understand the likely overall cost for getting to net zero. Do you have a rule of thumb of £1,000 per tonne of carbon dioxide reduction? For instance, each diocese will know how much money to allocate from funds or income. Now, I imagine the answer to that is incredibly case by case. From the sites that you went to for the Wayfinder project, what was the range, would you say, in £1,000 per tonne of carbon?
Yeah, I said, it's not a metric we've actually focused on. It's certainly something I can go back and do. So maybe that's an answer I can come back on rather than guess now. It is massively, and I would probably do that based on those categorizations of buildings. So there's a massive difference between a Sunday only used church, which actually you're probably actually not saving that much carbon, as you said at the beginning, because it's got quite a small carbon footprint to start off with. So yeah, I think that if I may, I'll come back on that question and do it per technology and per building, because I think that'll be more useful than just a generic one. And you've got a secondary school and you've got Sunday used churches all muddled in the same thing, because I think that's probably going to be misleading. So I'll come back on that question. And
also, presumably, the cost is a one-off, but then you get the carbon savings for the lifetime of the intervention. So again, that requires factoring in as well. I think our answer may be to Phil that it's complicated. If you're able to do a little bit of analysis on that, Matt, is that something you can do quickly and I could send around with the slides, or is that something that will take longer to do? Yeah, it might be next week, but yes, we can definitely get that out in the short term. Okay, thank you. The next question is from Alison. Question with boilers. If you're replacing boilers, it usually happens as an emergency, or certainly with urgency. We found that this is a barrier, as the heat source pump conversion takes longer than just putting in a cheaper, more tried and tested gas boiler. How do we change that? That's such an important question, isn't it? It's a very common situation.
Absolutely critical question, and it's really critical because we tend to, and we're not unique in this in the Church of England, most organisations do, we tend to push our boilers much further beyond the end of their life than would be advised if you went and asked an engineer. So I say 15 years is typical for a boiler lifespan, but hey, we have 20-year, even longer, 25 to 30-year boilers still out there on the estate, and we don't tend to have, the simple answer to that, and actually if you would go to SIBSE engineers and say, well, what's the answer to that? So, well, have a proper planned preventative maintenance program and replace your boilers after 15 years so you replace them before they break down. That's probably not the answer that we want to hear. And I would suggest the answer is actually slightly different from that, and which is why one of the recommendations there was to have a heating resilience plan. So we think before the boiler fails about what happens when the boiler fails. So we ought to be making sure almost with every single building we have is what happens when your boiler fails? Oh, a boiler's only 10 years old. Don't care. What's going to happen if that goes down? All the people from on the call who are, perhaps schools, building officers within dioceses, do you know what happens if that boiler fails in that school? And there are temporary heating solutions that are out there. It might be we go out and get a whole lot of electric plug-in heaters and we know we've got enough power that can do that. It may be that we go, look, that boiler room is next to the playground. We can drive a trailer on there really easily. There's a hire company down the road that we can hire what's called a temporary boiler room. And it basically is a packaged boiler. It has some flexible hoses on the back of it. We can plumb those straight in with a plumber for a few hours, work into our existing heating system. And we basically run the boiler from, bypass the boiler. We run it from this temporary boiler on the back of a trailer for the next 3-4 months or whatever, gets us through to the summer. And now we've got a 9-month window in which to look at it in. So we need to build up those resilience programs out there. There are different things in different places, but we need to know what those are. We need to know where you would go to hire that temporary boiler or temporary heaters from. Actually, we know that there's a hire shop in the next town along that we can go and do that. We know we need to go and hire a 100 kilowatt unit. That's going to be this big. We know we can get it there and we can park it here. And that way, actually, it's really going to help the resilience of those buildings as well, because when that boiler goes bang, you can probably get the heating back on in there within a matter of 12 to 24 hours, rather than sit there for 3 days going, what goes on? And then probably even, doing a like-for-like boiler replacement will take weeks to do. So you can probably solve it in days and buy you the time to do that. So we do need to be thinking in terms of heating resilience.
And thinking of a church setting in particular, some churches are moving, aren't they, to having maybe their gas heating for the majority of the building, but perhaps electric heating, say in the chancel, which then means that if your gas heating does fail, you at least have a part of the building that's still usable whilst you work out what your longer solution is.
Yeah, exactly that. And that's, I think, certainly in that period over the next, I was going to say 10 years, but it's 7.5 years, we're trying to transition. It's a really useful sort of byproduct of it, that if you're starting to move to electric forms of heating, particularly in certain areas, it means you've built up that resilience, because if your gas supply fails then, and we only need to look at the world, what's going on with gas supplies at the moment internationally. So if you can't get gas, or someone digs up the road outside and goes through your gas main, or your boiler fails, any of those things, you've got another solution, which is actually you've got some form of heating that comes off electricity. It may be imperfect, but yeah, that sort of bit of both works really well in that intervening time.
Now, I think it's one of the questions that we accidentally had disappear off the list by typing an answer to it earlier. Denise, let's give Matt a rest for a second. If I can come to you, there was a question about vicarages, and obviously those aren't covered by Matt's Wayfinders research, but they are very much part of the Routemap to net zero carbon. What kind of suggestions are in the Routemap around how we would look at our clergy housing?
So, I mean, it's very similar to all other types of buildings, really. And as Matt said, the sort of the planning ahead is sort of some of the key things. So one of the suggestions that we have is that for dioceses to have a retrofitting and maintenance plan in place for all of their clergy housing. and to have done stock surveys, so getting hold of an energy performance certificate, which will give you some ideas of things that might need to be done. And even if you can't do that for your whole lot of clergy housing, if you could get a couple of representative examples, a bit like has been done with the Wayfinders, it'll give you an idea of what needs to be done. Also, obviously, the sort of switching to green energy, and I know there's quite a few comments on that, so I'm not going to say anything more about that at the moment. But having a stock improvement plan, so you can sort of work out which bits need the most, which bits would give you the biggest carbon saving, and making sure that when that property becomes vacant, then you know what you're going to need to do. So those are the sort of the headline issues there. I think it's also worth being aware that sort of some rented properties, we do need to think about the legislation there, that some of them need to be certain EPC ratings by certain years. So it's worth reviewing that as well.
The next, thank you, Denise. The next question is from Lizzie, which is about any suggestions for listed buildings with little or no insulation and very high costs for doing anything about the roof. Now, the answer here would depend so much, not knowing the context of the church that it's being asked about. And because for many of our churches, actually, often insulation isn't the right direction to go in, because it's such a major installation if you're only running your heating a few hours a week, which is very different than if you're a church that's being heated all week round. And for example, if you have an easy to access loft void. I'm assuming from the comment about very high cost that there is no existing easy to access loft voids. Matt, any words of wisdom?
Yeah, I guess I absolutely agree with you in terms of that, putting into context of how often used that building is, and if it's what I have shorthand describes as a Sunday use church, it might get used for a Wednesday morning service and only on a Sunday, but you've got large gaps in between those usage, and you only need to heat for the time it's being used. Any level of insulation isn't really going to be that helpful, because it's not going to be able to retain the heat, however good it is, between one Sunday and the next Sunday. So it's about looking at the relevance of that. And actually, in those circumstances, we've got that sort of church, actually getting rid of the drafts can be massively more important than insulating. And sometimes that actually means going underneath the pew platforms, for example, and perhaps adding insulation in there, but actually with the more primary purpose of stopping cold air coming up your trouser leg or your skirt whilst you're sitting in the pew, which is far more unpleasant than not having insulation on the roof. Having said that, if you are doing roofing works and you have the opportunity to do it, that is the time to do it. That's hopefully a fairly obvious statement, but yeah.
And I've popped in the chat a link through to Practical Path to Net Zero. If you haven't come across it yet, it's a really good place to start. It's just sort of a 2-page starter on what the steps are to take, and there is a self-guided checklist version that you can use in your church. And then I'm also putting a link through to the National Energy Audit Programme. Again, that's a great first step for your churches, to get a church energy auditor like Matt to come out and give you a customised report for your own church that's specific to your own circumstances. Fred has asked a question. As we speak, the electricity grid is fueled 46% by gas and 4% by coal, so we cannot assume that electricity is a zero carbon source. A green tariff does not and cannot give you zero carbon electricity. Oh, this is such a vexed question. The main driver, we can completely agree on the second bit of that says the main driver must be to reduce overall consumption. Couldn't agree more with the second bit of that, Fred. We need to reduce the energy that we use and get the energy that we do use from greener sources. In terms of how we define net zero for our Church of England churches, we've got a set of criteria, which if the electricity or gas supplied to the building meet those criteria, then we consider it to be net zero for our purposes, very much on the basis that It's one of the easiest changes people can make to switch to a green tariff, and that the more people that switch to a green tariff, the more that drives the market to create more supply, particularly if you're buying your electricity or gas from providers which then invest in new green energy provision. And I will find the note that sets out those providers that we consider to be net zero, and I will put it in the chat. Denise or Matt, do you have anything else to add on that?
Yeah, I think when you look at kind of nationally, National Grid, for example, are looking to make their grid near zero carbon by 2035. It's a process that is ongoing. Whether they achieve that or not is up for debate, but it is very clear that the grid is decarbonising all the time. Technically, it actually also depends in which area of the country you're in. Often you'll find the more northerly you are, the lower the carbon emissions of the grid are, because that's where we have most of our wind resource. Depends on time of day, etc. as well. But the two things need to happen in parallel in terms of decarbonising our national grid, as well as putting in and having an increasing electrification to our heating, hot water, and in fact transportation at the same time. So just because it's not perfect at the moment shouldn't stop us from actually starting to move that towards an electrification of heating and hot water, because those two paths need to happen together. And
Denise, this very question has come up through the consultation on the Routemap to net zero carbon, hasn't it? And we're going to commission an expert external view on it to make sure that the criteria that we're using are about right. Am I remembering correctly?
You are remembering that correctly, yes. But I think, as Fred said, the real driver, really, we all want to reduce the amount of energy that we're consuming in the first place. But yes, once we have so for anyone that doesn't know, the Routemap to Net Zero consultation closed on Monday. So we are going through all of the responses. We'll be revising the Routemap, and then it will go to the General Synod in July. So the final document will hopefully be approved then and will be available. But for anyone who hasn't seen the Routemap, I will put a link in the chat to the webpage where it's still currently there, but just be aware it's not open for consultation anymore. That has now closed.
Oh, this is a very church-specific question, which does tax us. Richard is asking about heat pumps, finding locations for, this would be for a ground source heat pump, presumably, if you're a churchyard surrounded by graves. And I mean, that is a very real issue. Have you seen churches, Matt, that have managed to successfully find locations despite having burials around the church?
Okay, so if it's mentioned for ground source, it is incredibly challenging and quite rare. I have seen churches do it. They tend to be some very large ones. I believe St Paul's Cathedral has actually got a ground source heat pump element, and it tends to be done as part of significant building works where they're disturbing the ground in archaeology, and they can get below the archaeological level and then drill. Tends to be the areas in which it's done. If it's the question, I'm going to suggest the question might also be about air source heat pumps as well, and where you can hang those off, and a few little tricks. And obviously it depends massively on the individual circumstance of the building, but the air source heat pump units can go up onto roofs. So tower roofs and hidden valleys can obviously be very useful. I have seen one church actually install them internally inside what used to be the bell ringing chamber, where they've obviously got big external louvers and a lot of fresh air blowing around it. Not quite ideal, but actually an interesting solution that can be done. And they very much made sure the position of them was that actually the heat the cooling that comes off them when they're in heating mode was directly out to the outside air. So there are a few tricks and bits and pieces, and I think you probably saw on one of the pictures there of the school where it had some wooden trellis in front of it. You can disguise them. I had one church, actually it was, that actually planted some weaved willow in front of it, so it all having a live green screen. You've also got to make sure the airflow is good enough through, but there are lots of ways around. And if churches are on oil at the moment, they've got an ugly looking oil tank, and these things can often be more discreetly located than that. So they're not normally solutions, but yes, it is something you do have to work out and give some consideration to.
The next question is about solar thermal. So everyone listening in, if you're not used to the term, so solar PV is where the solar panels convert sunlight into electricity. Solar thermal is where they convert the sunlight into warm water that moves around the solar thermal panel and into the building. So the question here is about, does solar thermal have a key role to play? I've certainly never seen it come up in a church energy audit, presumably because churches use relatively little hot water. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, so basically, yes, the solar thermal is a good solution. It tends to be a good solution where we need large volumes of centrally stored hot water. So, which is why it works actually quite nicely in houses, because you want a bath or a shower and you use a lot of hot water when you do that. Within a large section of the Church of England estate, so the schools and the churches, we just don't need that large volume of hot water, and it tends to be quite distributed around. So in a church, it's probably just in the toilet and the kitchenette, and a little electric point of use one there is quite useful. And the energy that uses is really only used when you've actually got the tap running, depending on what type of whether you've got an instantaneous one or one that's got a very small store. But even the small store ones tends to be the water going through it rather than the standing heat losses on it that involve the energy consumption. So when you're just using it intermittently, a small amount for hand washing or washing up your mugs or whatever, electric point of use tends to be more relevant, and that's why it's far more relevant on our estate. So it definitely works better within schools. The only time I would see it being relevant on the buildings that we tend to have on our estate is either in tends to be secondary school sports facilities, and probably where you've got wet side, so we've got a pool and there's heavy amounts of showering. The reality is that actually dry sports units, if they're just used for pupils, they do not shower these days. So long gone are those days, which I remember of playing rugby and being all shoved into a communal shower at the end of it. That does not happen anymore. Most school showers actually don't get used, or maybe one does for the school teachers that cycle in and want a shower beforehand. So that's very minimal. And the other area is within perhaps our TEIs, where you've got a residential component and people are living on site and therefore have that bathing. That's where it's really relevant. But it hasn't come up very often because that's the exception rather than rule. But it is good. And I noticed that Paul had mentioned about solar eye boosts as well, which are a useful way of perhaps when you've got some spare solar resource coming from electricity generation, you can put it into hot water, which does really make a lot of good sense as well. It can sometimes be a useful solution where you've got that, you're sort of stuck in the middle ground somewhere. So yeah, it's all part of the toolkit, but just not common on most of our buildings.
Very good. The next is from Alison, that says that the Sunday Youth Church that you mentioned is in her diocese, and the report has been it was very encouraging and helpful. So that's lovely to hear. I'm interested in whether you see a tension between making carbon savings on a solution for current use and increasing future community use. We were discussing that just this morning, weren't we, Matt, about the fact that the objective here isn't to use the buildings less. I mean, it's the absolute opposite. It's about how can we have our buildings thriving and meeting their community needs, but the people in those buildings being comfortable through low carbon heating. Do you want to say anything more about that, Matt?
Yeah, this is really where actually electric pew heating is being suggested as being the best option, which it often is within a lightly used church, but you want to be removing the pews to have more community use. That tends to be where this sort of issue comes up. What we're often finding is actually, again, there's a middle ground in there to be had, that actually there's a core block of pews, probably more towards the front of the nave, which perhaps can be retained, whilst all the other pews, perhaps to the rear or in the north and south aisles, perhaps are actually able to be removed to provide that community use. So you've got a bit of both going on. And often I find that actually in the north and the south aisles, you can look at electric panel heaters on the walls, because the walls are much closer physically to the space, because they're not miles away in the middle of a nave, which by the time you've got a south aisle or a north aisle on it, it's a long way away. And they tend to be lower in height as well. So often that's a way of kind of trying to blend the two together. But again, I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record. It depends on the individual circumstances of the building.
So the next question, my church is looking now at changing our heating system. Where to go for suitable advice? With acknowledging a tiny conflict of interest there, Matt, where have you seen churches get good advice from?
So look, there is good heating advice on the CBC website and guidance there. There's a certain amount of sort of self-work you can do. Most dioceses have got a heating advisor, or they all title themselves slightly differently. It's often very useful to get advice from as well. Obviously, there's the Church Energy Audit Programme. Sorry, conflict, I deliver that one. So of course I'm going to say that's going to be brilliant source of advice out there. But that can be really useful in there. I'm going to flip the question very slightly as well and say where to be cautious about getting advice from. The person that maintains your existing boiler, they probably know your boiler very well. They know your heating system very well. You probably like them because they've helped you out lots when your boiler's broken down. They may not be the best person to go to get advice on what to do to change your heating system to something that's lower carbon, because they're probably going to be in the business of installing boilers and that's all they know. There are some very good ones out there, and I'm not saying that's, you know, never go to them, but I just counsel that bit of advice with the bias that it's inevitably going to come with out there. But yeah, I would say go and look at the heating guidance on the CBC website and go to your DAC heating advisor as the first port of call.
So I'm putting out a flurry of links into the chat. So the links that I've put in there are through to the heating guidance, through to our webinar page that's got the recordings of all of our heating webinars, a link through to parish buying that has got a new service that they're offering around net zero heating solutions. The Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers has a directory to find advisors and specialists, and then of course your DAC, and I imagine the person who's written the question probably already knows who to contact at their DAC, but I've put there the link for everyone through to the map with the contact details of every DAC around the country. Jeff, I hope that somewhere there you find the advice and help that I'm sure you so badly need. If you look at the heating guidance, there's some really useful sections in there. I think there's a section on the principles, which I'd really suggest you have a look at. There's a very practical section on pitfalls, which takes you through all the things that can go wrong and how to avoid them. And there's a very useful section with a checklist of all the information to gather and think about at the beginning of a heating project. And that's particularly useful if you're commissioning external advice that you have to pay for. If you can give them that completed checklist at the beginning, you're going to save yourself time and money in the advice that you gather from that person, because you'll give them all the information they need to give you good advice. And then very importantly, there's the option appraisal section, which helps you think through what the feasible options are for your church and how to narrow those down. So I do hope that you find those helpful with your project. The next question is about green hydrogen. This is straying a little bit away from church energy audits and Wayfinders. Do you have there's as many views on hydrogen, I think, as there are people that you ask for a view. Denise or Matt, in fact, is it something that either of you feel you have a comment to make?
I think I can make a very quick comment, which is I'd encourage Deborah to go and have a look at the Zero Carbon Britain work that's published by the Centre for Alternative Technology, which is kind of addresses the issue about where things like green hydrogen or syngas fit within the overall system. I am personally of the view, which I hope is a relatively informed view, that actually getting green hydrogen delivered through our mains gas system, as it is at the moment, as a substitute for that, is not something that's actually even ever likely to happen at 100% hydrogen level. A proportion of it can and does, but we really can't see that as being the mainstay of what's going to get us to net zero.
I think I'd just like to add that, I know that National Grid, or the gas equivalent, they are looking at all of this, but in terms of the Routemap, because the Synod target is to get to net zero by 2030, we haven't considered hydrogen as a solution, because the sort of generally accepted advice is that we're not going to have it at 100% green hydrogen in our gas pipes by 2030. So at the moment within the Routemap, we are not considering that, and that is why the reduction of energy and also if there's sufficient green gas, those are the options that we're sort of suggesting in the Routemap at the moment.
And certainly one of the things I found most encouraging about the Wayfinder research is that for each of the sites that's been visited, it's possible to move that site towards net zero carbon with existing technologies. I think that's a really powerful message to take away, is that we know how these things are done, and that we don't necessarily have to wait and hope that there will be a new technology come riding around the corner. We can get to net zero carbon with things that we know how to do right now. How are we doing? The next question says, the capital costs in the report we received, I'm not sure if this is a Wayfinder site or a church NG or an external, but anyway, it says the capital costs in the report we received excluded VAT, fees, main contractor overheads, etc., accepting that some costs might reduce. When you add in inflation, the actual capital cost presented could well be 30 to 40% higher in reality. So that's more of a statement than a question, but
yeah, let me, yeah, most costs do exclude VAT. That's fairly common and within these sort of type of reports. And the reason for that is different organisations and buildings will have different VAT treatments. So you may be able to recover some of the VAT depending on what type of building you are. Many buildings will be able to recover their VAT depending on various bits and pieces, and I'm not going to go into VAT within VA schools and those kind of things now, but to say that depending on what you are, you can probably recover VAT. A lot of things actually don't require a main contractor, and if they are broken down, if you're delivering the whole thing as one whole big project, then you might choose to go down that route, but actually I would say probably 80% of the time people will go along to their own individual, local electrician or whatever to get the LED done, then go along to their local heat pump person to get their heat pumps done, and actually there's never a main contractor involved, so that's why those are excluded that are in there. Inflation, absolutely, inflation is obviously very high at the moment, and the longer we wait to do things, the more costs going to have inflation, but that's got to be married about by the energy cost inflation as well, so the savings is going to be higher. So yes, the statement is correct, and those are the reasons behind that in there, and I'm not going to get my crystal ball out and guess what inflation costs might be in the next 7.5 years, let alone longer.
The other cost, particularly if you're looking at solar, that generally isn't included if you could get a desktop estimate from a solar installer, is the scaffolding. And so it's really worth getting a sensible estimate of the scaffolding cost as well. For some churches that can be very minimal. You might just need one section up and then onto a parapet. For other churches, you might need a much broader section of scaffolding, and therefore it's going to be a much more expensive job. So it is worth knowing that if you because you can get a free desktop estimate from any solar installer, always look for one that's MCS accredited. But it's just worth knowing that the estimate that you get won't include the scaffolding costs. Denise, you have your hand up. Go for it.
Yeah, it's one of those things that is, again, sort of like thinking about the forward planning, because if you're replacing a roof and that is going to is this roof suitable for solar installation, then that is the ideal time to have it, because you'll have your scaffolding up to do your roof anyway, so you don't have that cost twice.
Absolutely.
Can I particularly make a quick add to Denise's comment that actually that's really relevant within schools with flat roofs. If you're replacing a flat roof within a school, why not put solar on at the same time? So yeah, it's not just churches with pitch roofs, but others as well.
Now, the next question is, I think this one was posted at the very beginning when I shared the slide saying, really today we're focusing on those highest energy using buildings, not on the small rural churches, except the small rural churches have a low unit carbon emissions, but there are a lot of them. The aggregate total would be interesting. Also, they are typically the least able to raise significant capital sums. So in terms of the first part of that, I'll put a link in the chat through to the EFT report from 2020. But if I get to the right bit of it and screen share, then I can show the answer to that question. Has that appeared, Matt?
Yep.
Yep. So this is the national analysis of the energy footprint tool. This report is just the churches that have entered their data into the EFT, and then it's extrapolated up to look at what the national carbon footprint would be based on the sample of churches that have completed the EFT. And they have specifically that question about small churches. Let me find the right section. So this is the average carbon footprint of the small, medium, and large church. And then it goes on here. So this is the percentage of the buildings is the paler purple, and the percentage of the total carbon footprint from all of the churches is the darker purple. So you can see that around 25% of churches are small, and collectively they make up around 5% of the carbon footprint of our churches. And I always think that this chart is a particularly important one. So it's rural and urban, small to large. And just looking at that, it's making that point again that I made in the introduction, that the main causes of our carbon emissions, and therefore the main place that action is needed, are not our thousands of small, particularly small rural churches that already have a really low carbon footprint. The next question says, please could you comment on the recent increase on energy prices? I mean, I imagine we only know as much about that as any member of the public would from reading the news. As energy prices go up, it makes some of these interventions pay back much more quickly. But equally, I mean, it's such a difficult time for so many churches, and so, well, for every part of the church really, as the energy bills are going up. Matt, is there anything?
Yeah, I can say, firstly, I think, it's got to be said that we are going to be seeing some huge increases in energy prices, and domestically we've obviously got a massive increase coming in the cap, but it is still a cap, and that is still actually holding domestic energy prices down. So read in the media about commercial energy prices as well as domestic ones, and commercial energy prices are going up even more than domestic ones, which the shock that's causing is going to be considerable, and I don't think anybody can rejoice for one moment about the impact that's going to have, even though it probably will focus the minds more on energy efficiency. There's a really important dynamic, however, with heat pumps, and if I may just take a minute or two and do a few numbers. So there are two ratios that are really important around, and you probably noticed on one of the graphs that heat pumps didn't really pay back very well, and in some circumstances they cost more to run than a good efficient gas boiler. So there are two ratios, and I talked about the coefficient of performance ratio with heat pumps, and if you put 1 unit of electricity in, you get on average of a heat pump about 3.5 out. Ground and air to air will be a bit more, and air to water and high temperature air to water will be a little bit less. So let's just say it's 1 to 3.5, just for the sake of this, bearing in mind every heat pump is going to be different. The other ratio in that sum that's really important is the ratio of what gas costs are to what electricity costs are. So historically, within more of the commercial setting, we've been seeing, probably 12 months ago, gas prices costing around about 3p a kilowatt hour, and electricity costs around about 15p a kilowatt hour. So that ratio between the 3 and the 15 is 1 to 5. And because that 1 to 5 is greater than the 1 to 3.5 on a heat pump, is why a heat pump, when you've got a good efficient gas boiler, costs more to run than the gas boiler does. However, with the energy price changes we're seeing gas prices trebling, so they're going up to about 9 pence a kilowatt hour commercially, and we're seeing electricity prices not quite doubling. So I'm going to keep the maths relatively simple, although you do need to know your kind of 9 times table. And it's like, well, you've got 9 pence a kilowatt hour for your gas, and you've got about 27 pence a kilowatt hour coming up for your electricity. That's a 1-to-3 ratio. So the ratio, that kind of energy price ratio, has fundamentally about to shift. And that 1-to-3 is less than the 1-to-3.5, which suddenly means that actually installing heat pumps becomes much more financially viable within the new realities of where energy prices are going. We're not quite there yet, or we probably are on the day+1 wholesale market. We're not there yet in terms of the energy contracts that we have in place, because we've done sort of 1 or 2 year deals. But that is coming down the line, and is quite an important change there. But I think we've all got to be aware that yeah, the increases coming on energy prices, and the dreadful situation going on with Russia at the moment is just going to put more and more intensity on that, and there's a big shock coming to us all on that.
It's worth saying as well, there's that great phrase, isn't there, about the cheapest energy is the energy that you don't use. That it has always been true that it was good financially and good environmentally to be more energy efficient, but the more that the electricity and gas and oil prices go up, the more that becomes true. And if you can spend relatively small amounts of money on lagging pipes, draft proofing, turning out the lights, getting good lighting controls, getting good heating controlled, the basic steps that mean that you don't waste energy in your building, those steps will now be paying back even faster than they were before through not using the energy at all. The next question, this is definitely a Matt one. Did you consider ventilation and heat recovery?
Yes, and ventilation now has obviously taken on much greater importance with kind of reducing viral load transmission. Absolutely, and heat recovery when you are doing mechanical forms of ventilation is pretty much a no-brainer. Yes, it's important. It is quite difficult within. It's probably more relevant within schools, because that's where you can insulate more tightly, and therefore and probably need to ventilate more. Whereas you've got a church building which tends to be draftier and pretty well ventilated in any case, and much harder to insulate. It's less of a factor in that type of building. But within schools, it's more relevant, and the heat recovery tends to be quite relevant where you've got existing mechanical ventilation systems that are in there, where you're using natural ventilation, otherwise known as opening the window, then that's less so. And then you get into this balance about whether it's better to keep the window shut and have mechanical vent going on with heat recovery, or open the window and have systems that mean we're opening the window appropriately. And in this COVID era, that's got a lot of other things wrapped around it as well. So it's quite a complex question. But yes, it's certainly heat recovery is part of the toolkit, and in the right places is a no-brainer to do.
Now, despite doing a whole extra hour of Q&A, I'm conscious that we've got about a quarter of an hour left and 42 questions still open, which I think makes it about 20 seconds a pop if we're going to say. So I have to manage everyone's expectations that I'm not sure we're going to get to the end of the questions. And Matt and Denise and I, we need to be speedy with our answers if we can be. What is the reason for ruling out air-to-water heat pumps for either radiators or underfloor heating? Is the cost too high or energy savings not sufficient? Now, I think you weren't ruling them out, but they didn't come up on the particular sites that you went to.
Yeah, so absolutely not ruled out. They are a key part of the solution, and definitely where the underfloor heating is already present, air to water is the sensible thing to do. With radiators, it depends on how good those existing radiators are. So if there's a modern radiator system and the radiators are size big enough, then air to water can be viable. But where you're in a situation where you'd need to rip out the existing radiators and often pipe work that goes to them as well, that's when air to air becomes a much more viable solution.
Very good. How important is education and training? And is there a role for behaviour change? I mean, very and yes.
Very, very, and yes. And how important is education? Massively important. We need to be teaching climate change in our schools properly. It's not, that's probably not what the question meant, but I'm going to say it. Training, absolutely. And the real key thing is training our site staff, because they're the ones that probably have the biggest impact on how you're using those controls. So that's where we really need to get that training right.
And Denise, there's a whole section in the Routemap about capacity buildings, isn't there?
Yes, and I was just going to say on behaviour change, I think one of the things actually, every single one of us has got the opportunity to influence, you know, every time we put on a jumper rather than turning the heating up, or we switch off the light when we leave the room, we're living those behaviours, and that also then helps to influence other people. So, you know, that's something we can all take away.
The next question, with air-to-air heating, how do you stop all the heat just rising into the roof space and not heating the people?
Quick answer, you can't, heat will rise. So it's about what type of building you're putting in and what the insulation of those buildings are. So air-to-air, if you've got a church that's being used daily, obviously insulation becomes much more relevant, and you often find within those churches as well there are a number of smaller spaces, meeting rooms, etc., and the like, which are the rooms that are really being used a lot, and they tend to have much lower ceilings in any case. So it's please don't think I'm saying that we need to be putting in air-to-air in every church in the country with a massive high ceiling. A lot of cases we don't, and also there's a particular benefit of putting the floor-mounted air-to-air ones in where previously perhaps might have had a fan radiator in there, because it's blowing in the air at ground level, and then you get the benefit of the heat going past you on the way up to the ceiling, but without the disbenefit that you do with a fan convector heater. You don't get the cold air being drawn at the bottom, so you don't get the draft of cold air being sucked in around your feet.
And just reminding everyone again that the Wayfinders research was looking at those highest energy using buildings, which are basically all, apart from that one church, being used all week round, and therefore you're more likely to be looking at a space heating solution rather than localized heating near people. The average price of an energy audit for a church, I'm trying to remember this year's price, I think it's £550. Sorry, I'm speaking slightly out of turn at this point. From my memory of the National Energy Audit Programme, I think it's £550, but I'm afraid I would have to go and check that. I've put the link to the Energy Audit Programme in the chat, so perhaps you can find it out there. It is currently closed. It's seasonal because the energy audits run when it's from sort of early winter through to kind of this time of the year when there's big enough difference between the inside temperature and the outside temperature. So I think it's closed for new people for this cycle, and you would be registering for the next cycle. It's worth saying as well, sorry, I'm saying quick answers and then I've got two things to say. Some dioceses have their own energy audit schemes and the prices on those vary. Some of them go through a particular scheme where you get a free initial sort of slightly lighter touch energy audit at the beginning. So it's worth finding out what your diocese offers. Cost of running heat pumps.
Yeah, it's asking what kilowatt rates we've used in the presentation. In all of the audits, we tried to use the cost that the actual site was paying for their energy. So it does vary between site to site. But I would say generally we were using their current contractor rates, so they don't reflect the energy price hikes that we are now experiencing into the future. Broadly, as a rule of thumb, as I said, those figures I said earlier, roughly about 3 pence a kilowatt hour for gas and about 15 pence a kilowatt hour for electricity, broadly speaking, but it does change site to site depending on what they're paying.
The next one's more of a comment than a question. Early adopters are finding their suppliers and installers are no more.
Yeah, what I would say about air-to-air heat pumps is that it's the air conditioning contractors which are, because it is an air conditioning system, which are sort of, they've been around, a lot of those have been around a long time, and they are very skilled and knowledgeable about what they're doing, and are probably more established. The air to water ones, less so, and yes, I agree with that comment. You will find the good suppliers will continue, and the poor ones will fall by the wayside.
The next one I've dealt with a link in the chat. It says, please could you clarify what actually constitutes green electricity? So I've popped that link in the chat a few higher up. Do air-to-air heat pumps maintain a maximum temperature of no more than 19 degrees?
I think that's asking the question about can they limit the temperature, internal temperature? So can they behave in the same way as a normal heating system? Yes, you have an internal thermostat, and they will stop blowing warm air in once it reaches that set point. They can heat up to 30 degrees inside, depending on how big a room is and how big a capacity you put on your heat pump, and they can cool as well. So yes.
The next question is again about user behavior and behavior change, which I think we've touched on. I mean, yeah, yes. Yes, we need behavior change.
Yes, and I'm not going to go into answering that question about schools, because my answer will be way too long, about what certain pupils wish to wear in schools in the winter.
Are the individual reports and case studies available for inspection or reading? So I know that, so the name of the person asking this question is one of our DEOs. So if you're a diocesan environment officer, or you're another member of another one, as somebody in one of those key diocesan roles, then you will soon have access to something online that Denise is setting up. Do you want to just mention about the library of documents and good examples?
Yes, so we're developing a net zero carbon resource hub. It's going to be hosted on Moodle, which hopefully you're all aware of anyway, but if not, I'll be sending out links and instructions on how you can join it. It's going to be a sort of a private space, so it's not going to be, that's why it's not being hosted on the website. And what we're hoping is that if you've got great examples from your own work, that you can share those with me so that I can upload them onto the resource hub, and it will help everybody else to learn from each other. So it's already populated with quite a lot of information that we've received from diocese, and it's an ongoing work. So one of the questions in the net zero consultation Routemap was, do you have any examples? And I've got a whole list of people to contact to get more examples to upload there. It will be available shortly.
And the individual Wayfinder reports are just in the process at the moment of checking with the sites whether they want their report anonymized or not before it goes onto the Moodle. So they will appear there, but that'll take a little bit of time for me to get those answers back from the sites. The next one's a challenge, really, rather than a question. I don't believe the COP of 5 for air source heat pump. Most literature gives 2 to 3.
Yes, no, and I noticed someone else's, Phil's replied on that as well. I think it depends what type of heat pump you're looking at. So I think the timing of that one might have been actually, whilst I was going, just before I went through the types of heat pumps. So if you're talking about a high temperature air to air, sorry, it's a high temperature air to water heat pump, then 2.5 would probably be about right. If you're talking about an air to air one, it's going to be much higher than that. A low temperature air to water, most of those are now being on the market are around about 3.5, and that's an area where we've seen a lot of development in that. Incrementally, each new model that comes out in that COP is improving. So 18 months ago, I would have absolutely said, you know, a standard air to water heat pump would have been about 3, maybe a little bit lower, but that's now 3.5. So yeah, it moves over time.
So the next one is a comment from Emma in St Albans about the costs of having a temporary system. It's not really a question, it's just a very realistic comment on the costs of some of the things that need to be done. The question from Deborah, when you have very thick walls which act as cold radiators in winter, heating the building to a moderately comfortable temperature takes a long time. What role for insulation then? Reducing drafts is only partly possible. Again, I think that's more of a comment on the difficulties of doing some of these things.
Yeah, and again, it's going to come down to that individual building, and actually, if that building is only being used intermittently, and you can heat the people rather than trying to heat the air, and you can put a source of heat closer to the person than the source of the cold wall, and you can have a bit of insulation or a fabric or some timber paneling or something that's blocking that cold wall. There's loads of bits and pieces that can be done, but it's going to be down to that individual building and how it's used.
The next from Deborah, any plans for the church to negotiate better terms? Absolutely. I'll put the link in the chat through to the new area of the parish buying website, which is focusing on net zero carbon. They are gradually bringing on new services. They started last year with solar PV and low carbon heating, and they're working their way through a number of other services which they know are needed from the church energy audits. Is there a feed-in tariff available for church buildings? If only. There is a smart export guarantee for the spare electricity you don't use, but there is no longer a feed-in tariff.
Yeah, and actually what's interesting is the payback on PV panels on the current electricity rates, not the hiked ones that are coming through, is actually quicker now than it was when we had feed-in tariffs. So the good news is the feed-in tariffs don't exist because we no longer need them, because the cost of technology has dropped that much, that the paybacks are of a good installed PV system are such that we don't need it.
Looking at the time, I think the next question, because it's quite a meaty one on funding, will probably be our last. I can only apologise to the remaining 27 questions that, despite leaving more than an hour for Q&A, there's been so much discussion. Brian's question is the all-important one around funding. He's asking it specifically for schools, but let's answer it more broadly than that. If we start firstly with schools, Matt, in your experience, what kind of routes to funding are there for schools at this time?
Okay, so schools funding has changed massively over the last 18 months. So the savings loan schemes that we used to have disappeared. That most idiotic bit of government change in policy ever. They's need their head read for doing that, and we keep lobbying against that decision. But we've now got the public sector decarbonization scheme that comes round, is due to come around every year and actually increase in size. It is highly competitive, so you have to be ready for it. But that's in the same way as that the Condition Improvement Fund, known as SIF for schools, acts. So schools are quite used to working in that kind of environment out there. And actually, I have a meeting with the Department for Education in about an hour and 5 minutes time, where part of them looking at trying to coordinate those funding streams together is on the agenda. It will take them years to do, if ever they'll do it, but it is being worked on.
And looking more broadly, I'll put, I mean, there is no easy answer to the fundraising question. I'll put a link in the chat through to our new environmental fundraising page. You'll find on there links through to the recordings of the webinars and the upcoming webinars, directories of grant funders, and guidance about how to apply. All of the funds are competitive. We are researching internally grant funders that will exist. We have applied through the internal funding process within the Church of England, and we're beginning research into green, the possibility of green lending, sort of low cost lending for things like solar panels and lighting that pay back relatively quickly. So we are very much engaged centrally in where the funding might come from, but there is no simple answer to that. I often think it's very comparable to where we would have been 15 years ago, 10 years ago with disabled access, at the point when we became aware of the fact that there was this need to review our buildings and think about how we could bring it in line with the needs of all different members of our community. And what did we do at the time? We got individual local advice, found out what needed to be done in each building to enable disabled access, then did excellent local fundraising and applied for grants to find the money for it, to then implement that. And over a period of years, the majority of our buildings now do have disabled access. I think we're sort of at the beginning of that process, but for moving towards net zero carbon. And there's no ducking the fact that that will be difficult, but it's also something that the church has shown itself to be very good at over time, that kind of coordinated local fundraising. I'm looking at you, Matt and Denise, to see if you have any wise final words at 2 minutes to 2. What's the biggest takeaway you took from doing the Wayfinders, Matt?
I think the biggest one is that it is technically possible. This can be done, and it can be done with technology that we have now, and we already have installed, and we know how to look after it, how to service it, and is quite normal to us. So this probably shouldn't be seen as a big, scary, hairy challenge. This is about doing what we're already doing, but doing it everywhere and just avoiding the boilers in there. I've just quickly had a quick look through a number of the other questions, and I think we've probably answered most of them. But just to kind of remind everybody that the heat pump comment, which has been focused on a lot, is because we were focusing on these large energy using buildings. So please don't go away with the thought that this is something that needs to apply to every church everywhere. It's not. These are for very large energy using buildings that are being used very regularly on a daily basis.
And Denise, with your overview across the whole of the Church of England moving towards net zero, any final words to leave people with?
Well, there's lots, but I think that the key thing really is to think about the fact that we want to make some savings quickly. So there are things that we can do that are relatively cheap and relatively quick. So it's the keeping up the maintenance of your buildings, stopping that hot water tap dripping, turning things off, putting on the jumper. There are things that we can do to reduce our energy now that helps us save money as well as saving carbon. So that's my takeaway.
Thank you both. I'm just noticing from the chat, someone says they've joined us at 4 a.m. from San Francisco, California. There you go, worth getting out of bed for to come to this webinar. Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you so much, Denise, for all the time that's gone into preparing for today and then for running today's webinar. Thank you to everyone who's joined us, and the 43 who've made it to the end of a 2-hour webinar, so they must have been interested in what was being said. I will send you later today all of the links from the chat and Matt's slides, so that you'll have those to refer to afterwards. It generally takes me 2 or 3 days, but I will get the link to the recording up on our webinars webpage as well, so that you can find the recording there. I wish you all very good luck with your local challenges in getting to net zero carbon, hopefully feeling a little inspired and a little informed today about how to go about doing that. Goodbye all.